This is TWiT.
This past week was WWDC, and of course, several of my colleagues actually were over there and checking out what's going on in the Apple ecosystem. And of course, one of the major releases announced was iOS 12. And of course, there was a bunch of performance increases here. iOS 12 was, of course, showing that the fact that people were pretty upset about the performance in iOS 11. And so they wanted to increase the performance of 12 quite a bit. But there was also a ton of security improvements as well. So one of the biggest ones here, I want to start with the obvious, is the fact that iOS 12 will actually be available for all the same devices that iOS 11 supports. So this means that all the security improvements that you get over the years in the new OS will span a larger set of devices that weren't actually supported before, including the next generation ones. So Apple tends to kind of leave devices in the dust. So this is more compelling and appealing for people who actually don't want to upgrade right away. And of course, we also want to go through a lot of the other features, but I do want to bring in the co-hosts here, get their thought. We're going to go through each one and maybe talk about how this applies to enterprise and security. So I want to start with Curtis first. So just going back just to the easy one, the out of the box one here of, hey, now iOS 12 is available to all the older devices that are compatible with iOS 11, as well as all the new devices. Does this actually increase the surface area so that we can bring those security updates and all of the connectivity improvements back to the older devices so people can feel more comfortable?
You know, I think it does. And it's also one of the things that keeps iOS being a more attractive enterprise platform than Android in a lot of cases. You know, one of the issues with Android, people always say, well, Android has a broader footprint than iOS, and that's true. But no single version of Android has the footprint of iOS. There are, at last report, something like 73,000 different variations of Android, each with their own minor issues. With iOS now having a much broader footprint, going back a couple of generations on devices, both the tablets and the phones, it's going to make a lot of enterprise IT folks much more comfortable about keeping things on iOS, making sure their applications run on iOS, using the MDM for iOS. So I think this is a very savvy move on Apple's part to make iOS more enterprise friendly, while at the same time still not making any open pleas to the enterprise. It's actually pretty well done on that part.
Right. So I think I'll throw this over to you, Padre, as well, because I think that this kind of helps. If you think about it, you're kind of increasing the set of devices that are available now to your organization. And, you know, if you're providing your devices like to sales organizations or so on, now you don't have to really worry about, you know, paying the extra dollar for the really expensive newer devices. And you can be guaranteed that kind of surface area of security is taken care of. Do you think that this is something that's going to kind of drive forth the selling of more iPhones, or is this going to be just another gimmick that they're trying to do, basically?
It could do a little bit of both. One of the things to remember here is it sounds on paper like a great idea that iOS 12 is going to make older devices faster. And basically, there's a lot of technical ways that they've done that, but the main way is they've stopped the what they've done with newer versions of iOS, and that is it deals with what's on screen while also prefetching what it's going to deal with next. So in iOS 12, it separates those. It takes care of what's on the screen first, and then it moves on to the prefetch, which doesn't actually make the phone faster. In terms of overall usage of an application, it just makes it feel faster. But that's not a put down. That's actually important. So they've recognized that. They've recognized that they can make older devices feel faster, and for most people, that's enough, even if it isn't actually taking less time. Now, as you mentioned, this could mean that I can now take my old iPad, my old iPhone, and I can use some of the enterprise-y, and I use that word enterprise-y because they're not really enterprise features, to bring them into my network and maybe do interesting things with them. But I honestly don't see that as being a huge factor for the iOS crowd. The iOS crowd is already going to get the latest device. They're not really going to be affected by these updates. Most of the security enhancements sound nice, but we've already seen Apple bend over backwards to help governments who want to access that data. So the net result is iOS 12 slightly faster, slightly more secure, but I still don't think it's an enterprise device.
Right. It's interesting. You talked about performance, and PC Guy 8088 actually mentioned it. Does this mean that maybe they're actually having to test and tweak the performance of the newer operating system on some of the older devices? Usually when you put a new OS on an older device, you tend to not have that performance that you're going to get from the newer hardware. So this is interesting. They're actually opening their surface area to being more costly when it comes to testing when shipping the new OS as well. But we also want to talk a little bit about the security improvements they got here. So because there's actually quite a bit. Starting with SMS passcode. So this is interesting because when you go to do sometimes a kind of a two-factor auth kind of thing where you go to a site and they say, hey, go check your SMS for a passcode, enter it, like my bank does this. And so it's kind of a tough because then you have to go to you have to go over to your message and you have to look at the code and you either have to write it down or try to copy it. And sometimes you can't paste it and it becomes kind of a pain in the neck. This ability kind of lets you autofill. Just get that passcode in your SMS. They'll let you take that passcode and actually autofill in any type of field that lets you kind of enter it in there. Is this like, to me, they call it more secure, definitely a enterprise type thing for things that are doing two-factor. I mean, Curtis, is this just something that's going to like blow people out of the water, or is it just a convenience thing?
I think it's more of a convenience. I mean, it's something that you could do by taking a number of steps. This just makes it more of a convenience. And I think what it does is, in many ways, it's another step in shoving hardware tokens off into the dustbin of history, because this makes it so much easier to use something that you've already got with you, your smartphone, as a hardware token for two-factor authentication. I think that the good news is that we're likely to see two-factor authentication become even more prevalent in the enterprise. That's all to the good. I just wouldn't buy stock in a company that makes hardware tokens right now.
Right. Another interesting one is the password autofill feature. So this is kind of related, so the Apple's actually opening up access to their QuickType or password autofill, and essentially this will allow third-party password managers in, and they can then access it using their API. So this is interesting because now you can essentially enable kind of autofill for any password coming from anywhere, meaning whether it's a third-party password manager or not. Padre, is this something you think that's going to be big, especially things like authenticators and some, 1Pass and that kind of thing?
No. And for the simple reason is it's existed. It's existed quite well already on the Android space. Some of us use it a lot. I use Google Authenticator. And in fact, my multi-factor authentication includes a call out to my phone that says, hey, you've just signed in. Would you like to allow this? And I can say yes or no. And that's all encrypted. That's all protected. So that's existed. Some people are using it. The people who are using it will already be using the tools, and they're not going to switch over to this. The people who are not using will have no idea what it is. They'll have no idea why they would want to enable it, and therefore it's kind of a moot point. And again, that's why if you look at the rundown of iOS 12 advancements, most of them are really on the consumer side. And there's been some interesting stuff on the consumer side, but the enterprise and the back-end side, it's not exciting. There's nothing there that makes me say, okay, this is now my enterprise device. Definitely not more so than an up-to-date Android device that I might already have.
Right. So what about so there's this other feature. Let's get to this one. This what they call USB restricted mode. So this seems to be a direct hit across the bow of some of the government agencies out there because they're using this tool called Grayshift's Gray Key, which allows them to essentially kind of crack into the device by plugging into the USB and then running through, password options and so on and so forth. So this type of tool, actually, if you're connecting your device to USB, it actually will lock and prevent data access over the USB based off of whether you have a timeout or whatnot. Now, of course, previous versions of iOS actually let the data connection over USB to actually unlock the phone. So this is where I think they're saying, you know what, we're going to close that gap. We're going to stop that particular vulnerability from happening, and that tool is going to be rendered useless. So that's $30,000 that you're already paying for. That's going to go down the toilet, hopefully, with iOS. Curtis, is this something that we can say, I think this is something that just helps an enterprise maybe feel a little bit more comfortable saying, okay, then these devices are a little bit more secure. Now they're a little hardened. And of course, I think I feel more comfortable by kind of bringing it into my organization.
Yeah, and I think what this does is just, add some additional security to a device that has already been reasonably well adopted by large enterprises. I mean, if at a show like SAP Sapphire this week, it is astounding just how many iPad Pros were there, how many applications were shown using iPads, how many SAP applications use iPhone and iPad. So I think what this does is just make it a little easier for companies to embrace the iOS devices, add some security, and especially this should make it just a little bit easier to breathe about GDPR compliance. I mean, GDPR is having an impact that is bigger than many of us really think about on a regular basis. But when you talk to international business folks, it is a huge, huge deal. And everything that we see here in this new release of iOS will play very nicely with GDPR compliance audits.
Right. So I think there's, of course, a couple other here. We'll get through them really quick here. So there's, because Facebook ID registration. So now I'm sorry, not Facebook, Face ID registration. We got Facebook on the brain. Face ID registration. They allow you now to register another person for Face ID. So this way, I guess if you lose your phone or, have a family member. The other interesting thing is, starting to encrypt things. So like one of the examples is FaceTime now has encryption across the wire. It has encryption that allows you to supply security policies to that. So again, Padre, you kind of called this out already. You said, hey, none of these things are really that compelling. They're like, but are we starting now after we've kind of gone through a couple of them? Are they starting to add up? Are they trying to send a message? Are they saying we're getting there? Like, what is Apple trying to do here? Like, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure just by picking out some of these things from the wild here.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled too, because you'll remember with iOS 9, let's go back to iOS 9. When it released, there was a lot of kerfuffle made over the fact that it was enterprise friendlier, including things like policy and integration with Active Directory. And there hasn't been a whole lot since. I think Apple's actually okay with where iOS is. They don't need to make it an enterprise tool. And so the performance enhancements, like, for example, closing off the USB hole, which I think we can all agree was puzzling that it existed for as long as it did. It's sort of a nod to a few things that are happening on the security side, a few things that are happening on the enterprise side. But they don't need to pander to the enterprise. They just don't. They know that's not their area. The only time they get enterprise is when they have an executive bringing in a device under BYOD policy. So, what is Apple trying to do here? They're just trying to make people happy enough in saying, yeah, it's not the worst. It's not horrible. It's actually pretty good with security. It's actually pretty good with policy, but we're still selling this primarily as a consumer device.